The Kriegsmarine, the terrifying naval force of the Third Reich during World War II, manned by over 800,000 soldiers at its peak, with 22 of the particularly feared destroyer-class vessels at its disposal. Even one of these would be a formidable opponent. But several Nazi destroyer ships zeroing in on an Allied convoy? Boy, you are really in trouble. Today, a squadron of destroyers approach their prey, preparing for an easy victory until they see a huge shape on the horizon. A Nazi commander on the deck asks, "Is that an iceberg?" No, it couldn't possibly be. Wait, is that? But then, it's already too late for this hapless Wehrmacht battalion, as dozens of British Spitfires and Mosquito bombers seem to spill out of this massive iceberg, bombing and machine gunning the shocked Nazi destroyers into submission. How is this possible? Where did they all come from? Were some of the Kriegsmarine's most terrifying ships just brought to their knees by a rogue iceberg? Well, not quite. What we just described was the intended result of Project Habakkuk, a crazy brainchild of the British military during World War II. The grand plan? An aircraft carrier made of ice. Project Habakkuk was a piece of deranged military beauty, 2 miles long, 200 feet deep, and 300 feet wide across the beam. The Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier could carry 200 Spitfires, 100 Mosquito bombers, 404 British military officers, and 3,216 petty officers, soldiers, and workers. This icy beast would be around twice the size of your average aircraft carrier even today, and would be constructed with a practically magical new wonder material, Pykrete, a frozen alloy constructed of 14% sawdust and 86% pure ice. The Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier was a creation unlike anything military history has ever seen, and would remain to be unlike anything ever seen again. You're probably wondering, how come I've never heard of this? That's because the harebrained plan never truly saw the light of day, but it doesn't make it any less fascinating. It goes without saying that in addition to being some of history's biggest monsters, the Nazis were also huge weirdos. From the sickening experiments of madmen like Josef Mengele to the absurd and often impractical Wunderwaffe superweapons, Nazi military plans were quantifiably crazy. And sometimes to defeat crazy, you have to be a little crazy yourself. The particular kind of crazy that fueled Project Habakkuk came to us courtesy of one Mr. Jeffrey Pike. Pike was the kind of guy you'd love to have a beer with, seeing as spearheading the creation of an iceberg aircraft carrier is only one of the many interesting things he did in his life. He escaped a German internment camp in World War I after a near-death experience. He spied on Nazi Germany, despite being Jewish and thus in extreme danger, to find out what the German people really thought of Hitler, and worked on Operation Plow, which was an attempt to use another one of Pike's wacky inventions to help liberate Norway from Nazi control. With the incredible resume of a prison breaker, rebel, journalist, spy, strategist, and inventor, Pike made an extremely valuable friend, Admiral Louis Mountbatten. Mountbatten thought that Pike was a mad genius and believed that his strange strategic mind could be an asset to the British war effort. Thankfully for Pike, Mountbatten was the Chief of Combined Operations, a department of the British War Office tasked with planning attacks on the Nazi forces in Europe. It was during his work on the aforementioned Project Plow in the United States that Pike was hit by a bolt of inspiration. They were running out of aluminum and steel, and cultivating more of it was both time-consuming and costly. But do you know what sturdy material is an awful lot easier to make? Ice. Ice could be manufactured for only a fraction of the energy it took to manufacture workable steel, and numerous case studies had shown naturally occurring icebergs decimating thought-to-be unsinkable ships. If 9 times out of 10 icebergs beat ships, Pike thought, why not make an iceberg ship? Pike was so enthusiastic about the idea that he didn't even wait to get back to England to share it. He wrote about his plans and sealed them in a diplomatic bag with a written note that was only to be opened and read by Louis Mountbatten. The admiral, who seemed to be enamored with the idea that Pike came up with, immediately took the proposal to the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill was apparently taken with the idea too, and gave Pike and Mountbatten the go-ahead to further explore the idea of an iceberg aircraft carrier. This wasn't the first time a floating ice microisland for storing planes had been pitched, as a similar concept was suggested by German scientist Dr. A. Gerke all the way back in 1930. In every iteration since then, the idea had essentially been laughed off. Pike and Mountbatten were the only ones crazy enough to actually go through with it. But of course, for every crazy dreamer, you need some more down-to-earth experts to keep their feet on the ground. Max Perutz, a Nobel Prize-winning molecular biologist, was brought in to assess the feasibility of Pike's floating ice fortress. Sadly for Pike, Perutz didn't see much merit in the idea, as natural icebergs have only a tiny portion of their overall surface area above the water and were prone to tipping. While this isn't a problem for an iceberg, it would be a catastrophe for an aircraft carrier. To make this whole idea work, an entirely new substance would need to be created, and that entirely new substance was Pikecrete, Pike's Sub-Zero Ice Sawdust alloy. It was stronger, melted slower, and most importantly of all, was significantly more buoyant. Pikecrete also had the miraculous properties of being able to be carved like wood and set into shapes like metal, making it ideal for Pike's ambitious construction project. However, Perutz once again found a potentially devastating drawback. The entire structure would sag if not constantly cooled. In order to solve this, Project Habakkuk would need fitted external insulation and an interior ducting system and refrigeration plant. This would keep the carrier at a perpetually stable temperature and prevent potentially deadly sagging. Research on Project Habakkuk and the Pikecrete that made it possible continued in secret under the Smithfield Meat Market in London, where Pike and Perutz took advantage of the pre-existing walk-in meat freezers. If it wasn't absurd enough already, the secret experiments were literally hidden behind a wall of hanging frozen meat. But things were about to take another insane step forward, as a coalition of British and Canadian engineers began constructing a large-scale model in Jasper National Park of Alberta, Canada. Even at only 60 by 30 feet, a minuscule fraction of the intended size of the final carrier, the model still weighed around 1,000 tons. Testing was rigorous, with the main areas of focus being nailing the proper insulation and refrigeration techniques to make Project Habakkuk seaworthy, and the artillery and ballistics defense to keep it above water during battle. The grunt work of creating this huge model was performed by conscientious objectors to the war who didn't even know what they were making. Though even the top brass behind this clandestine military project probably harbored doubts about what they were doing. All except Geoffrey Pike, the true believer behind it all. He was watching his crazy dream come to life in real time. However, in April of 1943, Pike's dream project ran into trouble. Perutz, who had just discovered the perfect 14:86 sawdust to ice ratio for Pikecrete back in the UK, gave the grim warning to Pike that they'd have no hope of hitting their 1944 deadline if tests weren't completed by May, and the cost of Project Habakkuk was running into the multi-millions, with more outlays for steel reinforcement and insulation around the hull. It was quickly becoming clear that if a comparatively tiny-scale model was such a huge financial drain, the real thing would run up some truly monstrous costs. The whole planning and production process played out kinda like a bizarre dark comedy. During the 1943 Quebec Conference, where leaders of the Allied forces gathered in Quebec, a particularly strange incident played out. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt gathered to see a demonstration of the strength and durability of Pikecrete from Lord Mountbatten. In order to show the two world leaders how resistant the Pikecrete was to conventional arms fire, he pulled out his service pistol and blasted it, sending the bullet ricocheting around the room. According to the diary of one of the witnesses, Field Marshal Alan Brooke, the bullet rebounded out of the block and buzzed round our legs like an angry bee. According to Max Perutz, a similar Pikecrete ricochet incident almost saw Alan Brooke shot again in Combined Operations Headquarters back in England. It was a little less Saving Private Ryan and a little more Monty Python. But things were about to get a whole lot worse for Project Habakkuk. After the Canadian engineers said it was impossible to get the Project Habakkuk carrier finished in 1944, Pike's superiors at the Combined Operations Headquarters felt they needed American funding and participation to ever get this project finished. While the American government was willing to pitch in and get their own awesome iceberg aircraft carrier for their trouble, their involvement came with a pretty heavy caveat for one member of the team. Geoffrey Pike, the man behind all of this, had to go. While Lord Mountbatten was a big fan of Pike's eccentric style and his off-the-walls ideas, the American forces were not. He left a bad taste in their mouth after the failure of Project Plow, causing a rift between him and the United States Army personnel. Some of the top brass at Combined Operations, such as Pike's old friend John Bernal, had also grown tired of the bizarre inventor's antics and supported the motion to remove him from the project. Much to his dismay, Pike was removed and excluded from the project he'd conceived, and the work went on without him under the control of Bernal and Perutz. As the demands placed on the Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier grew, the cost continued to grow with them. The hull was made 40 feet thick to protect from torpedoes fired by German U-boats. The engineers had to figure out how to create a 100-foot rudder to steer the epic Berg ship. Spoilers, they did not. and combined operations had to choose between Pike's original design or the 3 designs presented to them by the Canadian naval architects and engineers. The whole project was becoming a chaotic mess, and criticisms from all sides were beginning to pile up, but the team persisted. Of course, effort and persistence can only take you so far, and not every seemingly great idea is destined to be fulfilled. In practice, the Project Habakkuk carrier had some huge issues. For example, because of its insane size, the carrier would only be able to travel at around 6 knots per hour, compared to the typical 30 knots of your standard aircraft carrier. The sheer amount of sawdust pulp it would take to create all the Pikecrete would have crippled Allied paper production during the war, and the sheer cost of creating even one Project Habakkuk aircraft carrier would equal the time, financial cost, and resources of constructing a whole fleet of more conventional ships. By December of 1943, it was finally concluded that Project Habakkuk aircraft carriers were too expensive and too impractical to ever be fully conceived. Even Admiral Mountbatten, one of the first figures of the Combined Operations Headquarters to believe in Pike's idea, finally withdrew from the project. This was officially the end of Pike's frosty dreams, and sadly, it wasn't all that long before the end of him too. Geoffrey Pike would take his own life with an overdose of sleeping pills in 1948, a mere 5 years after the end of his most strange and fantastical idea. Over the course of 3 hot summers, the 60-foot prototype was melted back down to nothing. Could this incredible iceberg aircraft carrier have turned the tide of the war even sooner? Well, nobody can really know, as the last of the Axis powers surrendered only 2 years later in 1945. Though one thing can't be denied. While his life might have ended tragically and his ideas went down in history more as curiosities than life-changing innovations, the world needs and always has needed people like Geoffrey Pike. After all, if you want to have a great idea, sometimes you need to be a little bit crazy. Check out Bear, who fought alongside soldiers in World War II, and Mad Jack, a real-life World War II madman, for more crazy World War II facts.